This is Chapter 4, Nutrition Needs During Lactation for Nutrition Across the Lifespan. So breastfeeding was the primary method of infant feeding until we developed infant formula, which actually became really common in the 1970s and 1980s. So prior to that point, breastfeeding was considered to be the primary form of feeding your baby. However, it had this really negative connotation to it, and it was often viewed as being dirty or not sufficient for babies, and it was actually seen as the preferred method if you were rich enough to be able to afford powdered formula or use evaporated milk. You may actually have great-grandparents who were actually fed evaporated milk or sweetened condensed milk as babies as opposed to being breastfed. And actually in the 1970s, feeding via breastfeeding was extremely rare. However, we started to see a change in the 1990s, and we've really transitioned into a time period where breastfeeding is becoming a more and more common practice among mothers. Now, in 2009, about 74% of mothers that were discharged from the hospital had breastfed at some point. Now, there are barriers to breastfeeding that exist. So we're going to talk about that throughout the lecture, but it's really important to understand that there are common barriers among all populations that prevent them from breastfeeding. So sometimes there's an inadequate knowledge, particularly surrounding how to actually get babies to latch onto the breast, how long babies should be fed breast milk only, the use of other nipples or other feeding devices that could confuse the baby. So maternal education level, we also know that the higher a female's education level, the more likely she is to continue to breastfeed. One big thing that has really transitioned in the last decade is hospital support during this stay. So, for example, hospitals are transitioning to the concept of baby-friendly. Nurses are frequently offering breastfeeding support right there in the room for moms. So that can be really helpful. Social customs actually do play a large role. So as I said, depending upon what type of societal messages are being sent as far as whether powdered formula is the big trend or breastfeeding is the big trend. Right now we do see breastfeeding is quite a big trend. Females posting videos on social media or pictures of breastfeeding. It's becoming more and more common, and so I think there definitely is a correlation between that and the frequency of it happening now, particularly in the United States. Another major component of breastfeeding that we have to discuss is maternal working status. So it's not easy to breastfeed no matter what way you look at it. However, it is extremely challenging to breastfeed once women return to work. And so one of the conversations in our country has been lack of support at workplaces for working moms. As most of you, I'm sure, are aware that leave during or after following pregnancy, postpartum leave, is not paid in this country. And so the most that a female can typically take under federal law is an FMLA, which is a family medical leave, and it allows up to 12 weeks for a woman to leave unpaid, or a man to leave unpaid for medical reasons, up to 12 weeks, and they are able to return to the position at the same amount of pay. So it basically secures their position is the only thing it does. Now, 12 weeks sounds like a long time, but in context, it often takes 12 weeks for the milk supply to be set up. And so prior to that time, moms may be feeding every hour. And so it can be really difficult. And then when you add into that we're having to stop every couple hours to pump breast milk and bring in the breast pump with us to work and have a place to store breast milk, it can become extremely challenging, and we see a huge decline in breastfeeding rates when women do go back to work quickly. Also, just beliefs, attitudes, perceptions about breastfeeding, as well as socioeconomic status. So The higher income level, we do see higher rates of breastfeeding, and that's pretty commonplace with what we see. Now, from a nutrition standpoint, human milk is this really unique, active, available substance that is basically straight out nutrients and wonderful other substances that are readily available for immediate use. In breast milk, we also see stem cells and antibodies to provide further support for a growing infant's immune system. And what's super fascinating about breast milk, if you've never heard it, is that it varies constantly. So the changes in the macronutrients can vary from the first start of the feed to the end of the feed, as well as various times throughout the day. And additionally, can vary related on what's going on into the environment. And as I said before, breast milk is uniquely produced for each lactation cycle. So what that baby needs is being produced right away. So we know that there are some benefits to breastfeeding. And one thing I would like to start off by saying is breastfeeding is best. It is estimated that exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life can reduce infant death rate by 13%. However, let me go ahead and throw out this disclaimer that a happy mom and a happy baby is a fed baby. So even though we support breastfeeding and we want it to be a mother's first choice, we're going to talk through a few of the reasons why moms may opt not to breastfeed and talk about, from a public health approach, how we can better support moms to make this choice. However, it is very, very important that we always remember, once again, fed baby equals happy baby, which equals happy mama. So if families choose to formula feed, there may be several reasons for doing so, and we need to be supportive either way. Another thing to think about is that we see a decrease in the risk of SIDS, so sudden infant death syndrome, when babies are breastfed. We see this enhanced intestinal and immune function as babies are getting those antibodies. We also know that breast milk actually nourishes the flora of the gut, and babies actually have half the rate of being hospitalized due to diarrhea. There's a possible risk reduction for developing allergies later in life if a baby is exclusively breastfed for 4 to 6 months. It's commonly reported as a huge component for breastfeeding. However, there's mixed evidence on that. We know that there is this improved psychosocial response to stress, meaning breastfeeding really enhances an infant's comfort and stability in a new environment. And breastfeeding with skin-to-skin contact is superior to all methods of pain control when an infant is in pain. One thing that we have to talk about that is frequently talked about with breastfeeding is this concept that it helps reduce weight. Well, we do know that women who breastfeed for at least 6 months are more likely to return to their pre-pregnancy weight. So it has to be that at least 6 months. We also know women who feed breast milk for a total of 2 years or more throughout their lifetimes. That can be 2 or 3 separate pregnancies. And those that also carry the BRCA1 gene, so a breast cancer gene, have a significant reduction in their risk for developing the breast cancer. Also, there's a significant reduction in ovarian cancer risk. And then let's be really honest, there's some societal improvement there. I mean, breastfeeding can help reduce the extreme financial burden associated with parenting new babies. For those of you who may not be aware, formula is quite expensive, about a month's supply of formula. The lowest type of formula can cost anywhere from $60 to $100. So you add that with diapers and daycare and everything else. And so we're really talking about breastfeeding is also being a reduction in family cost. It can save approximately $1,700 at minimum. And exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months could save each U.S. state about $200 million per year in the money that we actually give out through the WIC program to provide formula. So thinking broad scope about this, again, I want us to just really think and challenge ourselves to think about that public health approach. And we do see in Healthy People 2020 that breastfeeding is a really important subject because of what we know about how mothers do better and infants do better when we breastfeed. It is included. Now, some of the things you will see, however, on here is not just the recommendation for babies to breastfeed, but it's these different components like babies who have ever been breastfed. So even just being on the breast once and taking in colostrum, which we'll talk about in just a minute, is important. And then if you can get them to 6 months and if they breastfeed to 6 months, that's an important number. Getting them to a year. But then further than that, thinking about policies and big organizational shifts to support breastfeeding, we really want to see an increase in lactation programs for employees, places for them to pump, places for them to store breast milk. And we also want to see support from hospitals and ability for women to get assistance after discharge. So let's back up and talk about the A&P side of it, because it is such a wonderful and beautiful and unique thing to be able to breastfeed. Something is clearly happening in the body that I feel like we need to talk about. The female body is uniquely designed to create breast milk for a human infant. And the breast itself has many parts, including fat, connective tissue, lobes, lobules, ducts, and lymph nodes. Now, each breast has a number of lobules that are made up of small hollow sacs called alveoli. And so you can see those kind of down at the bottom of the screen there. They kind of remind me of what you would also find similar in a lung. And then we also have these lobules are connected by a network of ducts or thin tubes that group together at the areola. So the areola is the actual large portion of dark circle around the nipple. And one important point I want to point out is milk producing structures are nearly the same in all women, regardless of breast size. So we often hear concerns about having small breasts and not being able to breastfeed. These structures are all the same, no matter how large or how small a breast is. So breast size is actually largely determined by the amount of fat within the breast, and muscle tissue separates the breast from the ribs. One thing I want to talk about is the actual hormones behind what happens when we breastfeed and when milk is produced. So during pregnancy, we have 2 unique hormones that are critical for milk development. And those are prolactin and oxytocin. And they really help prepare the mammary system for milk production. Now, prolactin surges during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. This is actually released by the pituitary gland. And as the fetus continues to develop in the 3rd trimester, we see an enlargement of the mammary glands of the breast, preparing for that production of milk. Now, once the placenta separates from the mother, milk production responds based on supply and demand. The infant suckling actually stimulates the pituitary gland to release prolactin and oxytocin. And then these hormones also help contract the uterus, almost like just same thing as having the baby, helping that uterus, that muscle, return to its pre-pregnancy size. One of the important things to know too is what occurs with milk in the first few days during milk production. It is not actually milk, typically of what you would think it would be. It's called colostrum. And it actually, we like to call it liquid gold in the nutrition world because it really is liquid gold. It's the first part of the milk production, typically 2 to 5 days. And this is really when the milk is coming in. It is a very tiny amount. Even a drop of colostrum is important to get to that baby's mouth because it is absolutely rich in antibodies. And it helps a baby. It's almost thought of as like a baby's first vaccine, okay, because it helps develop that newly established immune system. It is rich in lactoferrin and white blood cells and a growth factor. Now, after 2 to 5 days, we see what we consider to be lactogenesis 2, so what we call transitional milk coming in. And this is where we start to see lactose, the sugar present in milk, being present in it. And then lastly, around week 6, we start to finally see a mature milk come in, and that's considered to be lactogenesis 3. And this amount of milk is really how much milk and will be the mature milk throughout that first year of life. So let's talk about what is actually in human milk. I wanted to put this picture up because human milk can look differently than real milk. And it may be kind of hard to tell here, but breast milk tends to be almost a little thicker and tends to sometimes be more yellowy in color. You can actually leave human breast milk on the counter for quite a long time without it going bad. And it's important to know that breast milk is mostly composed of water, so it does satisfy a baby's fluid needs under normal conditions. And so typically you will not need to give a baby additional water. Breast milk or formula is typically enough. We would just tell moms to monitor their baby for signs and symptoms of dehydration, so like a sunken head, around sunken eyes, elasticity to the skin. They'll cry but not actually have tears come out, and a lot of times we'll ask breastfeeding mothers how many times their baby has had a wet diaper that day, because it can give us a sense of, are they urinating enough and are we meeting those nutrient needs. From a macronutrient standpoint, typically human milk ranges from about 65 to 70 kcals per deciliter, and that really differs and depends based on the fat and the protein, particularly the protein. So studies show that mothers who produce higher quantities of milk tend to have lower milk concentrations of fat and protein, but higher concentrations of lactose. Lactose is the primary carbohydrate in breast milk, so remember that sugar milk component. But the thing that we typically see is fat is highly variable in breast milk. We're going to talk in just a second about hind milk, but it's important to understand that milk at the start of a feeding has a lower fat content, and then as it progresses on at the very end, we see in hind milk is very high in fat. So almost think about it like dessert, like you get all your protein, your carbohydrates with your meal, and then you want a really high fat, yummy meal at the backside to keep you full. And that's how we kind of think of that. The protein in breast milk actually doesn't change a whole lot. Typically those protein needs are pretty similar based on, however, I will say, so preterm milk, so before mature milk, is a little higher in that protein. The protein that we see in breast milk is casein and whey, and we often see like a non-protein nitrogen complex there. Lastly, I do want to point out, as far as the fats go, one important component that has to be in human milk is DHA. So in 219, we talk a little bit about essential fatty acids. And I think at the start of this course, we talked a little bit about those omega-3s and omega-6s synthesize DHA. And it's really, really critical for the development of neural tissue. So it's really important that mothers take in adequate DHA to be passed on into the human milk. It's about 200 milligrams per day. And so if they're not consuming those fatty fish items, we want to see that they're potentially taking maybe a fish oil supplement. Thinking about micronutrients, I did want to point out for the fat-soluble vitamins, we do have some specific concerns and just notable things. Typically, we don't have to worry too much with vitamin A and vitamin E. Typically, if a mother is eating a well-balanced and varied diet, that milk has plenty of vitamin A and vitamin E. Now, vitamin D, however, really varies based on how much vitamin D the mother is consuming and how much exposure to sunlight. Typically, almost all breastfed infants will be supplemented with vitamin D on a day-to-day basis. And vitamin K is actually also really low in breast milk. And so when infants are born, they get an injection of vitamin K to prevent any bleeding diseases. As far as water-soluble vitamins, unfortunately, the maternal deficiencies can result in those low concentrations in the breast milk. However, clinical problems in an infant related to these water-soluble vitamins is fairly rare. We see most of these water-soluble vitamins in our fortified foods for moms, and so typically we don't have too many concerns. Probably the only concern we would really have is potentially B12 with vegetarian or vegan mothers, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So as we talked about the changes in breast milk, it changes throughout the time that a mother is breastfeeding, but it also changes within the feeding. So remembering at the first that we have colostrum or liquid gold, which is small amounts, but provides so much bang for the buck. At 6 weeks, we have a very high concentration of antibodies, and we're starting to build up that mature milk. And at 6 months, we're really high in calories and omega acids for the brain development. And that's really that mature milk process. Now, within the feeding, we see foremilk, which really helps satisfy the baby's thirst and is lower in fat. And then in that hind milk, we see it to be thick and creamy, and it's very high in calories or fat. So basically, hind milk being your dessert. Now, some nutrition recommendations during lactation. What we do know is that maternal nutrition status really has minimal impact on the macro content of milk. Now, in extreme conditions of malnourishment, the fat and protein may be compromised, but overall, we don't have to worry too much about the macros. It's wanting to make sure mom's getting enough micros, to be really honest. And there's no specific foods a mom should eat or avoid while they're breastfeeding. However, if it is something that we see over time, the pediatrician sees baby is not doing well, maybe seems like an allergic reaction, they may recommend for moms to stop taking in foods with dairy items or other grains to try to see if that eliminates it. And one interesting thing is mom's diet during pregnancy and breastfeeding can actually impact child's food preferences. And so eating a wide variety of foods can give that baby a taste for that food. Eating spicy foods, eating lots of fruits and vegetables. What we know from research is that the amniotic fluid while baby is in womb in the breast milk can mimic some of these flavors, making children want to consume a more wide, varied diet. So what do we tell our lactating moms to eat? Well, we can always use My Plate, which we know is a wide variety of food items. And remember, just brush up on what the food groups are with that as well. We do know breastfeeding women have slightly higher nutrition needs. So similar to pregnancy, we have a higher BMR. The energy spent for milk production is about 500 calories per day in the first 6 months and 400 calories per day afterward. So thinking similarly to that third trimester of pregnancy, needing about 400 to 500 extra calories per day. What we do know is breastfeeding moms should not take in fewer than 1,800 calories per day, even when attempting to lose weight. That will drop them below their BMR where they can produce milk and keep up all healthy body functions. So some of the specific nutrition tips for lactating women, we want to make sure that they are getting in the adequate micronutrients. So we want to recommend whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. We want to make sure they're taking in an adequate vitamin D. We want to make sure that they are potentially choosing fat-free or low-fat dairy products if they are tolerating that well, and choosing healthy fats. Now, one thing I said I would talk about is the concept of vegan or vegetarian moms. It's not uncommon, but there are certain things we really have to monitor. Because vegetarian diets are variable, they can take in all different kinds of things. We really want to talk to these moms about what types of protein they're taking in and ensuring that they're combining those amino acids. So for those of you who don't remember, proteins, there are two types, complete and incomplete. Complete have all the essential amino acids, essential to eat. We have to get them in with our diet. An incomplete protein doesn't. And typically, animal-based proteins are complete and plant-based are incomplete. However, you can combine certain incomplete proteins to get all the amino acids. So for example, you would want to consume vegetables with seeds. So thinking about adding pecans to a salad. You would want to consume beans with grains. So thinking about a bean burrito with like a whole wheat tortilla. When you combine some of these items, then you actually are able to make a complete protein. So talking to moms about the protein sources they're taking in. Furthermore, those healthy fats, are they getting in those omega-3s and omega-6s? Always with that conversation, we're concerned about iron as well. So maybe getting an iron panel for them. And then as I said before, B12 is always a concern. And so they may require additional supplementation for B12. So feeding in early infancy. So what we do know about feeding babies is that infants are born with this ability to feed, no matter whether it's breast or bottle. And the infant feeding cues actually begin as soon as the infant starts to feel hunger. Now, babies can become very agitated if their feeding needs are not met. And I will absolutely tell you from experience, you do not want to be struggling with breastfeeding and have a completely irritable, agitated baby trying to get them to latch. It is much, much easier to get your baby to latch if they are in this stage, like on the left side, where they're rooting with their fist to their mouth. When they are in a much calm manner is a much easier way to get them to latch. We don't want them to get to this stage on the right where they're completely agitated. So we really want to feed them right before the signs of the middle stages of hunger. They'll start to stretch and move, and they'll flail their arms. They'll bring their hand to their mouth and suck on it. And these are all cues that they are ready to eat. Sometimes, as I said, you have this rooting reflex where if you touch their cheek, they'll turn towards it and attempt to try to get to something to eat it. Now, how do we breastfeed? Well, there's lots of different ways to breastfeed. We call these different breastfeeding positions, and then the latch is the actual mouth of the infant to the breast. So the first thing you want to think about is one of the easiest way to hold your baby to breastfeed is to be navel to navel, meaning their belly button to your belly button. You want them to be at that angle. So there's a couple different ways to do that. You can do that as a cradle, as you see here, where you're kind of holding baby to one side and cradling them. You can cross cradle them, so you hold them across your body to the other breast. A football method where they kind of sling under your arm, or sideline where they are feeding right next to your breast that is laying down. Now, the nipple should be in line with the center of the baby's lower lip, and the mother and baby may need to have eye contact in order for this to successfully happen. You want the baby to have a very wide mouth latch, so that both the chin and the nose are in contact with the breast. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, it's going to look like you're smothering your baby. However, that's exactly what we want. If babies latch too thinly, it does not create the right type of contact for positive pressure to get the milk to flow down, and it is extremely painful. It is going to be uncomfortable. It is not going to feel normal for the first couple weeks. So we want to offer all the breastfeed time we need to make sure breast get empty. Because they get hungry. Breast, there's one area, there's one area, it's for the first time period, you're constantly worrying, like, actually, breastfed babies have been increased their rate of their first talk to themselves. How they're having creative feeding, then they get a day, or they eat a have at least 6 hours a day. So those are all signs that you get. So this is the would say, they felt like the baby was nursing, or breastfeeding was not going well. It was hard, maybe formula was working it, there was maybe not maybe concern over the baby difficulty doing it, or issues with it. So what can we do? I mean, these big conversations, we have support, even if you want to get women to support. So there's class, talking to women about feeding mom avoid this decision. Another reason is social or cultural issues, or women that it's important that they make their own choice about feeding and not to feel embarrassed, or not to get concerned about other people's opinions. Everyone's concerned about returning to work and how you be making sure pregnant moms have resources to go ahead and think about in place for them when they have insurance plans. And it's like maybe you want to get babies to a lot of types of holds, looking at our nipple and seeing if it's actually not or just pain and sore. Not just making sure that moms just everything else in their really check the free sore, they have local leads, don't get support. Because ultimately, it's complicated breast support. That's another problem that we're concerned about. This can be very this can be called entering the breast tissue or milk can plugged up and becoming infected. You get tissue extremely painful. You have to prevent mastitis. You have like waste time or feed fully empty and take antibiotics. So it's process. Another person is, and So this is actually a genetic disorder, and it's called EXS, the carbohydrate lactose, one of the base monosaccharides. It's a really rare metabolic disorder. The body realizes, and we're just lacking enzymes, and actually accumulates and damages brain and tissue. So fortunately, when this and so we want to say to specialize in the metabolic disorder as HIV can be transmitted from movement through. So we want to be positive mothers are receiving it, and they know their infections. It really depends on women. So in areas where it may be there for money because when there's a baby develops some type of infectious disease or diarrheal disease process, which has a greater risk of death than potentially acquiring HIV. However, to be provided with a capacity. Now, mothers in areas of water supply and low infant mortality, which is breastfeeding, automatically contraindicated. Typically, they're closely monitored and they are receiving medical care. They may be a however, if mom hearing to her maintenance, if the viral load of the HIV is too high, we should not breastfeed. We would not provide an adequate substitute, which could mean nothing, or it could mean. Now, neonatal joints is actually really common. They have become yellow because of the fact that bilirubin, which is a byproduct of protein metabolism, becomes a little toxic in their blood. I mean, when the babies are born, the liver is just not mature enough to get rid of all the bilirubin, and so this is an extremely common thing. When we become really concerned is when this lasts past 48 72 hours after a baby is born. So you'll often see these babies receive what we call blue light therapy, where they're under a blue light. Sometimes it's very mild. Babies may go home and be told, have parents tell the people to how to sit with a baby on a blanket inside the window, allowing them to get sunlight. Now, these babies can do breastfeed, but ultimately do want because we're trying to get rid of the bilirubin in the system. So they might use a supplemental nursing system, just meaning adding additional doses to the baby. And I think this includes taking related to mental disorders. They actually pass through a breastfeed evidence about treating moms regarding their mental disorders to figure out what we should do. A list of medications that will save moms eating and breastfeeding. And so if we have these conversations with parents before mom has babies, sometimes we find alternatives. So examples like when mom's corticoid drugs passes through the placenta, passes through breast milk, baby becomes sick, right? Sometimes some medicines for diuretics may be inappropriate for lactation. Some high cholesterol medicines, statins specifically, decrease the fat in the breast milk. So really, our mothers priority if they are on something that needs to be changed. Really contraindicated. It can pass through the breast milk. Pass through alcohol again. With a tiny breastfeeding can be adjusted for occasional alcohol consumption. You will actually see over the course of by strips that moms can stick in the breast milk to test for alcohol following. Moms may have to get to pump to have a breast milk supply for the baby to be fed during the time that she's consuming alcohol, and then she may have to do pumping to towards during that time and getting rid of it if it still has the alcohol in it. Coordination. So this is actually the coordination. We want to exclusively breastfeed at 6 months of age. No formula, no baby cereal, no food items. That is the recommendation from the Academy of Pediatrics. Then at 6 months, we can start developing breastfeeding because mom and baby want to something this go to. From a societal standpoint, teaching education about breastfeeding to help moms change mom baby. We store breast milk, so it's a 3 or 4 hour temperature. And after that, we need to refrigerate it. It's good for up to 5 days, and then freeze it.